When I have a problem and I don't feel like taking responsibility for it, I blame someone else. Much like Greta Thunberg, I hold previous generations responsible for my problems and, in general, for all the ills of the world. A generation like that of my parents. A generation raised on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. When being young became the new ideal. When moral behavior consisted in little else than just being authentic. Doing your own thing, man. When the noble pursuit of freedom basically amounted to defying authority and the nostrums of the previous generation. Sounds like a lot today, doesn't it? But it all started in the 1960s. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economics Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and we're continuing our series on free speech in universities by taking a look at critical theory, the New Left, and the 1960s. So last time I indicated that the cause of some of the problems with free speech on university campuses today might have roots stretching back decades. That intellectual currents of an earlier time may be informing the assault on free speech and academic freedom today. Well, I think a lot of this can in fact be traced back to the era of the 1960s. Now, jumping back into the 1960s puts us back into the thick of the Cold War. The West, and in particular the United States, versus the Soviet Union. With Europe a potential battleground and Asia an actual battleground. For anyone disillusioned with Western capitalism and liberal democracy, the USSR provided an alternative way of life and ideology, made all the more attractive when you could idolize it from the comfort and safety of the West. Which is precisely what many progressive intellectuals did. Initially, during the Stalin years, when the Soviet system proved to be crueler than it was thought to be, one could simply attribute it to the evil of Stalin himself. It was an isolated incident. It was not representative of the logic of the system as a whole. It was just Stalin. However, this sort of approach became a lot more difficult, much more difficult narrative to sustain when his successor Khrushchev rolled tanks into Hungary in 1956 to quell the revolution there. Now, this didn't mean that progressive lamentations about Western injustice were entirely off the mark. I mean, indeed, some countries bungled up the process of decolonization, and then, of course, there was always that sticking problem of Vietnam. But this shouldn't deter us from the fact that over the next couple of decades, the cracks in the Soviet armor widened, and while progressive intellectuals may have found myriad reasons to disapprove of the West, the translation of this disapproval into praise for the Soviet Union became progressively less tenable. In 1974, the English and French translations of the Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago effectively laid to rest any of the illusions about the paradise of the USSR, at which point progressives found other causes to champion, such as environmentalism or human rights, but those are stories for another time. Now, the changes weren't all political, of course. Socioeconomically, there were big things going on too. One of the most important was the post-Second World War economic boom in the US, Western Europe, and Japan. Rising wages all across the board pulled the proletariat up into the leisured middle class. The baby boomer generation was brought up in comparatively fortunate conditions with unprecedented luxury, comfort, attention, and economic security, which you could also say meant that they had minimal exposure to uncertainty, risk, and the idea that liberty and prosperity are fragile. You could say then that they might have been less hesitant to take ideological risks, to break from traditions and the past. Now, some of these archaic prejudices did indeed need to be attacked, such as racism and sexism. But one of the interesting things, or one of the interesting consequences of the growing middle class was the swelling of university enrollments. University, after all, was the key to middle-class dignity and prosperity, to a white-collar profession instead of a blue-collar profession. And this is a trend that has not abated up until the present day. For example, if you look at the share of laborers in blue-collar jobs in the US around 1950, it's about 30 to 35%. Jump across the pond over to the UK, in the same time, it's about 40%. However, skip forward about 60 years, and in the US, that share has fallen to about 8 to 10%. Similarly, in the UK, in around 2010, was about 11 to 12%. And along with this, more people were also going to university. So the percentage of the US population with a college degree increased from about 5% in 1950 to about 25% in the year 2000, and even 37% in 2020. And in the UK, it was 3.4% in 1950 and 33% in 2000. And so this change in the share of the population attending university could also have certain consequences on the perceived role of the university. Was the university about providing instruction or providing a societal service now? Are students there to be taught, or are they consumers whose needs are to be satisfied? As the saying goes, the customer is always right, and this is even more so the case as tuition rises. But there were still other novelties of the 1960s. One is that being young was no longer treated as just a stage preparing you for adulthood. It had its own dignity, even, you might say, its own finality. And it had its own heroes. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. Actually, you move forward a few decades, throw into the mix Kurt Cobain, and even more recently, Amy Winehouse. What do all of these people have in common? Well, for one, they all died at age 27. And in many of their cases, in all cases, they were musicians, and in many of their cases, they were rock musicians. And this was another important development of the 60s. As purchasing power increased, youth found other ways to distinguish themselves and their lifestyle from that of their elders, their parents. One way was through purchasing rock and roll records. So to give you a few more statistics on this point, youth between the ages of 5 and 19 spent at least 5 times as much on records in 1970 as they did in 1955. Richer countries in general had a more booming record industry. So youths in the US, Sweden, West Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain spent between 7 and 10 times as much per capita as those in poor or rapidly developing countries of the time, such as Italy and Spain. Now, the widespread of rock music across many countries underscores another novelty. It's internationalism. Because while the birth of the teenager was not restricted to any one country, the teenager's preferences and tastes across countries were largely homogeneous. American and British rock music enjoyed universal appeal even if you didn't understand the lyrics. So too did fashion items like blue jeans, which had gone from being a standard piece of clothing for the proletariat to becoming fashionable and trendy for the bourgeoisie. And perhaps the most interesting part of all is that adults started emulating their youthful children, such as by putting on a pair of jeans and going to work. Now, ironically, amidst all of this consumerist and capitalist behavior, when we turn to the intellectual currents of the 1960s, we're faced with ideas that both reinforce the youth's behavior, but at the same time criticize the consumerist culture that enabled it. This paradox has come straight through to our own time, as intellectuals preach liberation, all the while condemning the economic system that has been most conducive to liberation and individual self-expression. For in the hallowed halls of academia, critical theory was incubating, along with other sorts of meditations on the problems of capitalism, industrial society, technology, and, frankly, modernity in general. The solutions of yesterday no longer seemed applicable to the problems of today. I mean, sure, on a policy-making level, Keynesianism may still have been popular in the 1960s, but it was much too content with bourgeois culture. It failed to really get to the heart of the matter. And even Marxism, for that matter, was somewhat problematic. Because on the one hand, you might feel that it hit some of the right themes and was on the right side of history, but on the other hand, it was just too focused on economic issues. Not to mention the proletarian class that was being absorbed into bourgeois culture. So what was needed were theories that retained the radicalism and the slogans of Marx, but provided a more comprehensive, updated, and effective assault on bourgeois culture. And this is why so many progressive flavors of the month, even today, still tend to be seasoned with a little bit of Marxism. Now, one such taste that we still can't get out of our mouths is that of critical theory and the New Left, cooked up in universities in the 1960s. So what is critical theory and the New Left? In brief, critical theory is the idea that your thinking about society is itself a social fact. So that means that your thinking is a product of the very process that it describes. Now, what this means is that there's no standpoint outside of society from which you could objectively analyze society. In and of itself, this is not such a serious problem. I mean, all you need to do then is reflect on the structures that determine your thinking. You might say you need to reflect on the power structures underlying our society. You recall in the last video, I suggested that opposition to free speech on campus might have more to do with power than with free speech. Well, the power structures underlying our society can be anything from traditions to institutions to ideologies that sustain certain inequalities and prop up the establishment or those people who enjoy privilege. The logic holds that if there's an inequality in place, whether it be of race or gender or whatever categorization you choose, it exists because of a certain power structure, some sort of ingrained privilege or systemic inequality. Now, you might think that you're a free thinker and therefore you're not subject to any power structure. But that's where the New Left would say that you are wrong. Why is that? Well, for one, insofar as you contribute to the system, you are unwittingly perpetuating its injustice. But the other thing is that the power structures determine even the way that you think about things. And so you're not thinking as freely as you might like to think. And to be determined means that you are not free. And the objective is freedom, but not freedom the way Hayek understands it, as we explained in a previous video, but freedom as in human liberation, where you are free from all necessity and constraint, whether that necessity or constraint results from material scarcity or whether it results from traditional morals, where profit and exploitation are abolished. So human liberation being where profit and exploitation are abolished and you become your own master and mankind achieves universal happiness and freedom. Sounds like a pretty tall order. And this is why a certain activism tends to underlie the New Left's analyses. You identify and reflect on the power structures or ideologies or institutions or traditions that oppress you so that you can overcome them. For the New Left, one of the most oppressive structures is capitalism itself. This is because capitalism has this annoying tendency to assimilate its erstwhile opponents. For example, the New Left notices that the working class, what used to be the vanguard of the revolution for Marx, the New Left notices that the working class now can't really be relied upon because they've been corrupted by bourgeois morals. They're not really interested in revolutionizing society or drastically altering the way that we interact with one another. It turns out, actually, they're really just more interested in getting a job or starting a business, buying a home, raising a family, getting ahead, that sort of thing. Bourgeois morals, in other words, have corrupted them. And so, if you want to get rid of bourgeois culture, you have to start to look to a time or place that hasn't been infected by bourgeois morals. It was popular in the 1960s, and it's probably still popular today, to idolize the third world, to argue that it was desirable for the US to become more like China, or Vietnam, or Cuba. This is really just an updated 20th century version of the idea of the noble savage, right? The idea that there's a certain virtue to being untouched by civilization. Now, unfortunately, our society has already been corrupted by civilization or bourgeois morals, so that means we have to revolutionize our society. But there's a nagging question this whole time. What all counts as bourgeois morals or bourgeois culture? Capitalism, okay, fine, sure. But what about liberal democracy? What about freedom of speech? The idea that free discussion and the use of reason might themselves be products of bourgeois society, to be uprooted along with that society itself, had occurred to the man considered to be the father of the New Left. And I speak here of a man called Herbert Marcuse. And I'd like to take a little look at some of what he's got to say. First, let me say that by pinpointing Marcuse, I don't necessarily mean to exclude other thinkers of great importance to the development of some forms of left-wing thought, such as a figure such as Antonio Gramsci, who introduced the notion of cultural hegemony. Nor do I suggest that Marcuse's ideas caused the intellectual upheavals of the 1960s. Indeed, it seems just as likely that the youth's push for sexual liberation, for example, was a reaction against the conservative morals of their parents, and that Marcuse's support for sexual liberation as well could conveniently be worked into his philosophy. I choose Marcuse, though, because he represents a fascinating synthesis of so many intellectual and socioeconomic trends that go some way to explaining our current problems with free speech in universities today, and actually many of the problems in our politics in general. Okay. So an aspect of Marcuse's synthesis is that he sort of affects a marriage of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. And he's not the only one to do this. This sort of synthesis is true more generally of what's known as the Frankfurt School, which emerged in Germany in the 1920s, of which Herbert Marcuse was also a part. Okay, so Marx and Freud. Well, both Marx and Freud are important because they represent a rejection of oppressive structures, whether those structures be exploitative capitalist relations between human beings, so that would be in the case of Marx, or whether they are repressive traditional morals in the case of Freud. Marcuse's liberation philosophy, then, sees anti-capitalism and the overthrow of our bourgeois society as leading towards a libidinous or erotic freedom in which we live in peace and harmony, all of which resonated with students in the 1960s, I'd say still with many people today. Now, Marcuse knew, though, that the proletariat couldn't be depended on to carry out this important mission. So, who would then? Well, here's what Marcuse has to say. Underneath the conservative popular base is the substratum of the outcasts and outsiders, the exploited and persecuted of other races and other colors, the unemployed and the unemployable. They exist outside the democratic process. The fact that they start refusing to play the game may be the fact which marks the beginning of the end of a period. And included with this group, or these groups as well, are students and people from backward countries. Because ultimately this has got to be a global and a total revolution. It can't just happen in one small segment of the world or in just one country. Now that's interesting. So that means that students have a key role to play here. In other words, those fortunate enough to go to a university have a key role to play. That they're naive and impressionable and in some cases not yet employed is actually an asset. But they can't change society through words, or at least certainly not through the free exchange of opposing views. And this is why universities are such a contentious battleground, because on the one hand, universities are supposed to produce ideas and get people thinking by rigorously defending free speech. And yet, on the other hand, the new left writes off free speech as fraudulent because it's bourgeois. Parenthetically, I'd add that in the 1960s, because I'm using the word bourgeois a lot, in the 1960s you could use bourgeois basically in this new left thinking as a catch-all for everything that's wrong with society. We don't tend to hear the word so often today, but I dare say that today you could substitute in words like white or patriarchal, and basically you have the exact same way of thinking. Okay, so is there any room for tolerance here? Marcuse would say yes. There's room for true tolerance. But true tolerance, I quote, cannot protect false words and wrong deeds, which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Society cannot be indiscriminate where the pacification of existence, where freedom and happiness themselves are at stake. Here, certain things cannot be said. Certain ideas cannot be expressed. Certain policies cannot be proposed. Certain behavior cannot be permitted without making tolerance an instrument for the continuation of servitude. And Marcuse goes on to say that combating indoctrination and developing the forces of liberation may require apparently undemocratic means. They would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion. Today we would also add gender. Or which oppose the extension of public services, Social Security, Medicare, etc. Moreover, the restoration of freedom of thought may necessitate new and rigid restrictions on teachings and practices in the educational institutions. So to sum it all up, liberating tolerance would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Okay, so what are we to make of all of this? I hope I am not taxing your patience by extensively quoting thinkers, but you know how much I love doing that. And so to deliver the verdict on Marcuse, I thought, I couldn't put it any better than the words used by someone probably less well-known than he deserves to be, and less well-known than many of the great thinkers that I'm accustomed to citing in these videos. He was a Polish philosopher and historian of ideas named Leszek Kolakowski, who wrote a fantastic work in the 1970s, by the way, a 3-volume work called Main Currents in Marxism, which is, to my knowledge, by far the best thing that has been written on Marx and Marxism ever. So I highly recommend that you check it out. Okay, so here's what Leszek Kolakowski from that same work has to say. Marcuse combines contempt for science and technology with the belief that we must strive for higher values because all the problems of material welfare have been solved and commodities exist in plenty. To increase the amount can only serve the interests of capitalism, which lives by creating false needs and instilling a false consciousness. In this respect, Marcuse is typical of the mentality of those who have never had to trouble themselves to obtain food, clothing, housing, electricity, and so on, as all these necessities of life were available ready-made. This accounts for the popularity of his philosophy among those who have never had anything to do with material and economic production. Students from comfortable middle-class backgrounds have in common with the lumpenproletariat that the technique and organization of production are beyond their mental horizon. Consumer goods, whether plentiful or in short supply, are simply there for the taking. Contempt for technique and organization goes hand in hand with a distaste for all forms of learning that are subject to regular rules of operation or that require vigorous effort, intellectual discipline, and a humble attitude towards facts and the rules of logic. It's much easier to shirk the laborious task and to utter slogans about global revolution transcending our present civilization and uniting knowledge and feeling. You know, it occurs to me, Felix, this is, I've gone on now for a while, and I don't think I've actually mentioned anything about Hayek. So I should probably say something, right? I should probably say a word or two, I should probably say a word or two about what Hayek has to say about this. You know, it's interesting that in the 1960s, actually, well, you had a lot of this going on university campuses and a lot of these sort of academic disputes, New Left, everything like that. Hayek actually was concerned with, well, comparatively mundane matters, I suppose, like inflation and monetary stability. That being said, it is worth noting that two of Marcuse's most important intellectual influences, right, Marx and Freud, are the two names Hayek associates with the superstition of our time, of his time, of our time. He says this in the epilogue to Law, Legislation, and Liberty, that part being published in 1979. But we also find in Hayek's final work, The Fatal Conceit, published in 1988, that Hayek has something to say about the alienation or unhappiness we experience in modern life, which is what the New Left's philosophy of liberation is meant to resolve. One is that material prosperity goes hand in hand with a bad conscience, because we remain aware of the pockets of poverty that still exist, and we see the gulf between our prosperity and the poverty of others. So it's ironic, in a sense, the richer we get, the more well-off we are, the more this sort of trend to hate capitalism may actually be exacerbated. And we also see, though, that despite our enjoyment of material wealth, we're still unhappy or unfulfilled in some way. Hence, there's a sense that something must be wrong. The system must somehow be at fault. And what's worse, it's a system that people feel they don't truly understand because nobody designed it. Now, the other thing that Hayek observes, and here he probably has more in common with late Freud than he cares to admit. The other thing that Hayek observes is that the so-called oppressive order of capitalism and bourgeois society that Marcuse and the New Left love to hate is in fact civilization itself. In Hayek's words, On a less sophisticated level than the argument against alienation are the demands for liberation from the burdens of civilization, including the burdens of disciplined work, responsibility, risk-taking, saving, honesty, the honoring of promises, as well as the difficulties of curbing by general rules one's natural reactions of hostility to strangers and solidarity with those who are like oneself, an ever more severe threat to political liberty. Thus, the notion of liberation, although allegedly new, is actually archaic in its demand for release from traditional morals. Those who champion such liberation would destroy the basis of freedom and permit men to do what would irreparably break down those conditions that make civilization possible. So as you can see, Hayek is in total agreement with Leszek Kolakowski. Civilization and our very freedom depend on us setting limits and rules for ourselves. So another interesting thing here is we see polar opposite assumptions concerning human nature. On the one hand, Marcuse believes that if we can get rid of all of these oppressive structures, we will end up in the land of milk and honey, living in peace and harmony with one another. But that assumes that we are by nature peaceful and harmonious creatures. Hayek, by contrast, believes that stripping away civilization, stripping away the rules and traditions and constraints, would take us back to our decidedly more tribal selves. For Hayek, by nature, we might not be as pure and perfect as we'd like to think. In the epilogue to Law, Legislation, and Liberty, he writes, "Those non-domesticated savages who represent themselves as alienated from something they have never learnt, and even undertake to construct a counterculture, are the necessary product of the permissive education which fails to pass on the burden of culture and trusts to the natural instincts which are the instincts of the savage." So one of the reasons, if we're deceiving ourselves concerning the nature of man, if we think that by stripping away all of these things that restrain us, that we're going to all of a sudden end up all happy and loving each other and cooperating and peaceful and everything like that, it's because we have been able to cooperate and live harmoniously and peacefully with one another thanks to the very restraints that have been imposed upon us by things like by hard-won freedoms and our systems and our institutions, such as liberal democracy and capitalism. So we're naive if we think that we can get rid of these fetters, which are in fact the very buttresses of our civilization and our well-being and our freedom as we know it. Civilization and freedom require discipline. Because we see where Marcuse's logic takes us when it refuses to say no. We find that in some areas, Marcuse goes beyond even the Soviet Union. For example, the Soviet Union had at least acknowledged that subjects such as mathematics and physics, natural sciences, they have their own laws. There isn't such a thing as a Soviet or a communist mathematics. Marcuse, in ways all too familiar to some on the left today, believed that these subjects too had been corrupted by bourgeois morality, and as a result they had to be overthrown. Similarly, he believed that the forces bringing about the revolution of bourgeois society should be permitted to use violence because these forces represent a higher justice. And in any case, the use of violence would be justified in these circumstances because the system we're currently living in, the system that we are unwittingly perpetuating, according to Marcuse and the New Left, is a system of institutionalized violence. So in our society, there's already violence being perpetrated. It's just systemic. and therefore using violence to overthrow it not only makes sense, but it's actually called for. And once you've made that logical leap, then there's no reason not to break the law and commit acts of violence. Once you've made this logical leap, you may in fact be considered guilty or immoral if you do not break the law and commit acts of violence to overthrow our institutions. But Hayek mentioned something else in the earlier quote that I'd like to return to. He said that the notion of liberation, I'm citing him here again, the notion of liberation, although allegedly new, is actually archaic in its demand for release from traditional morals. The reason I find this interesting is because we have this tendency to view the 1960s as this time of novelty, great ideas, free speech, speaking truth to power, and social movements, and so on and so forth. And I'd like to suggest that on university campuses, at least, if not perhaps even in the wider society and wider political discourse, there may have been a lot more conformity and a lot less novelty in the 1960s than we care to admit. Now, on the one hand, you did have free speech, activists fighting against bans on political activity on campus. So in the United States, for example, you had the creation of the Students for a Democratic Society associated with the University of Michigan and the free speech movement, especially at UC Berkeley, where restrictions on freedom of speech were coming from the conservatives and not from the progressives. And in other countries, we find that student protests had their own, national flavor. So in the UK, these protests included opposition to nuclear weapons, as well as to certain politicians deemed reactionary, like Enoch Powell, for example, in his famous Rivers of Blood speech. In West Germany, you had protests against any lingering Nazi traces in German politics. In Japan, the protests were against perceived authoritarianism in the state, industry, and military. And in Paris in 1968, what started as a small student protest had spread like wildfire, bringing in workers and paralyzing the country for a brief period. Now, in many of these cases, these protests, of course, made a lot of sense. And there's a real reason to be in support of free speech against a lot of authoritarianism or things like that, or various prejudices and forms of discrimination that still existed. But on the other hand, these protests all seem to take the form of a rebellion against the traditions and powers that be. They promised universal happiness and freedom, which sounds nice, but what exactly is that supposed to mean? Where were the ideas about where our happiness and freedom would come from? From different institutions? Okay, if so, then what kind? From virtues? Different ways of life that we're supposed to adopt? Then if so, which? Which sorts of virtues, apart from the ones that simply involve doing your own thing and being yourself, being authentic? So ironically, what I'm getting at is that in this time of alleged intellectual ferment, you could be absolutely certain of the specific proposals and general worldview of students and progressives. Make love, not war. Down with authority. It's forbidden to forbid. That sort of thing. In 1987, Allan Bloom wrote that famous best-selling book, The Closing of the American Mind, which, like some of the other things I've mentioned in this video, reads like it could have been written just yesterday. Bloom argues that the 60s were in fact a period of dogmatic answers and trivial tracts, with no books of importance being produced during that time. Interestingly, Bloom argues that red baiting and McCarthyism was actually good for the universities. They had a sense of community defined by a common enemy. McCarthy being the common enemy, who was the barbarian at the gates. Protection of free speech in those days actually meant something, because the countercultural ideas considered unpopular with the public at large were not so unpopular in the university. But when these ideas started to gain traction with the wider public, then all of a sudden academic freedom became less necessary. And so it became fashionable to abandon the defense of formal freedom, of academic freedom, of free speech, in favor of supporting substantive causes, such as sexual liberation, ending all war, fighting poverty or overpopulation, and so on and so forth. But what was most appealing about these causes was less the cause itself or even its feasibility. Rather, the cause was a useful way to strike a noble pose, an opportunity for performative outrage, what today we might call virtue signaling. Because very few people genuinely wish to give up their material comfort to end world hunger or conflict or climate change. And those who are so selfless don't feel the need to publicly flaunt their self-righteousness. But virtue signaling and histrionic displays of performative guilt are useful for another reason. If you're really good at them, then they're an easy way to achieve fame and notoriety. Because for all of the left's pretensions to equality, some of them are still endowed with ambition, that very human drive to get to the top. Amidst all of the conspicuous compassion lurks a covert elitism. Virtue signaling is an easy way to get noticed, to put yourself above others. And this is important in a society where we believe everyone is equal, because if everyone is equal, then how do we distinguish ourselves from each other? And we must distinguish ourselves because each and every one of us likes to think we are unique and special and deserve to be seen. And that's how movements, for example, that originally supported things like toleration, literally from tolerare, to put up with something, how a movement from toleration turns into a movement for acceptance, which turns into a movement for coerced celebration of groups or peoples deemed to be oppressed or deemed to be invisible, not being seen, not being appreciated somehow. This is the natural consequence of a society that values two contradictory things. On the one hand, equality, the idea that we are all the same, but on the other hand, individualism, the idea that we are somehow all unique. We need to be distinguished from one another. Now, what was and still is interesting in so many of the university cases concerning free speech and protest in the 1960s, and actually today, was and is how complicit and even enthusiastic so much of the faculty and administration is. Because you remember earlier I said that adults started emulating their children and the youth by, assuming their fashion, like blue jeans and stuff like that. Well, you see the same movement of adults or people who should know better taking on the values and the morals of their students in the universities. So why? Well, for one thing, the left-leaning professors see in their students' behavior the grandiose result of their convictions. Their ivory tower ruminations can have a real effect in the street. They can play Aristotle, and they can have a share in the glory of their Alexander. Like Marcuse, they may feel that one must tolerate only movements of the left, which is perhaps one of the reasons why some of the harshest backlash at universities has been against left-leaning advocates of free speech. Left-leaning people who say, we have to draw a line, a limit somewhere. Because you don't expect your own family to betray you. And perhaps some of these professors and administrators in universities, perhaps some of them even have doubts about the legitimacy of their own university. They suffer from a bad conscience. And in such a situation, all that's needed to force collective capitulation is a small and vocal minority to express their outrage. Okay, I could go on much longer about these sorts of issues, but I will leave that to future videos. And if you're interested in future videos on similar topics like this, in postmodernism, for example, which I haven't even touched on, or more new left stuff, then do let us know. However, in the next video, I'm going to continue our series on free speech in universities by going back even further in time to get a better idea of another ancestor of a lot of our present discontents at the university, because he's lurking always in the background of so many of these videos that I've done, namely the big man himself, Karl Marx. But let me close by saying that I started this video as a continuation of the previous one on free speech in universities, and I held the youth generation of the 1960s, perhaps unfairly. I held them, to an extent, I held them responsible for the pushback against free speech and some of the problems in our universities today, and as a result, some of the problems, the wider problems in politics today and in our political discourse. But every generation grows up. So what of the generation of the 60s? Well, you can always ask them yourselves, but there's also the amusing example of Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the student leaders of the May 1968 riots in Paris, even if his participation was rather minor. What did he do later? Well, later he joined the Greens and became a member of the European Parliament. It turns out the revolution doesn't always devour its children. Sometimes the system absorbs the revolutionary, for better or for worse. And that's what Hayek would say. You know what's funny about this banner here is that it doesn't matter where you move, his eyes always seem to be following you, no matter where you are in the room. It's one of the most mesmerizing and also creepy things. Anyhow, everybody, thank you for checking out this video. We put a lot of work into these videos, so we hope that you're really enjoying them. If you have been, then please feel free to suggest a topic that you'd like us to deal with in a future video. We take all sorts of suggestions, and Hayek has a lot to say about all sorts of different things. And, most important of all, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.